A millionaire swore he'd make her his wife, but on their honeymoon, he discovers she's still a virgin. They say when a man has everything, there's nothing left to long for. Daniel Hayes once believed that. He had a celebrated restaurant in Seattle, where golden lights bathed each table and turned every evening into an occasion. He had a high-rise apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, where each dawn spilled silver across the horizon. At 37, Daniel had traveled further than the fisherman's son he once was could ever have imagined. And yet, as he glanced at the woman beside him on their wedding night, a thought slipped quietly into his mind. Do I really know her at all? Clara Morgan, now his wife, didn't come from his glittering world. She worked in a small flower shop in Portland, her hands often scented with freshly cut roses, her gaze calm and gentle like a spring morning. On their wedding day, Daniel held her hand and whispered, "I promise to love you, to protect you, and never let you feel alone." Clara only smiled, her small nod enough to change the course of his life. They married on a gentle afternoon, no extravagance, no display, only the sea, the breeze, and the people who truly mattered. Daniel believed that from that day forward, everything would be complete. He was certain he had found the missing piece of his life. But on their very first night as husband and wife, Daniel discovered something he had never been prepared to face. Something no amount of wealth could fix, no measure of success could replace. In Clara's glistening eyes, he saw a silence, a tender secret she had never spoken aloud. He let out a quiet breath, watching her slender figure, and wondered, do I truly know the woman lying beside me? Or am I only just opening a book whose every page is still locked away? Daniel Hayes wasn't born into the glow of fine dining or the glitter of city lights. His childhood began in a small coastal town in Washington, where waves broke against a weathered dock and the smell of fresh fish drifted through every morning. His father was a fisherman, his hands rough and his skin bronzed by the sea. His mother was a seamstress who stayed up late at her old sewing machine, stitching clothes line by line to keep food on the table. While other kids played along the shore, Daniel often sat by the window, watching his mother mend shirts as the wind howled outside. He knew early on he was different. While his father dreamed of full nets, Daniel dreamed of flavors. He loved standing by the small stove, watching his mother sprinkle salt into a pot of soup or toss in a few herbs from the garden. Sometimes, he secretly mixed his own flavors, scribbling messy recipes onto scraps of paper. "Cooking won't put food on the table, son," his father once told him, a heavy hand resting on his shoulder. But Daniel only stayed quiet, staring out at the ocean, thinking, maybe I'll find a way to prove him wrong. At 16, he landed a dishwashing job in a small harbor diner. No one paid much attention to the skinny boy with messy hair and soapy hands. But Daniel watched every plate that left the kitchen. He studied how the cook tossed vegetables over high heat, how just the right touch of seasoning kept fish from tasting too strong, how a simple garnish made a meal look like more than food. After hours, he lingered to clean, then practiced cutting vegetables, experimenting with flavors. The passion burned quietly but steadily inside him. With a scholarship, Daniel enrolled in a culinary school. Those years were grueling. Mornings filled with theory, nights spent working in restaurants to cover rent. Many nights he fell asleep over his recipe notebook, his hands still scented with garlic and onions. Yet in those long hours, his style began to take shape. Respect for simplicity, letting pure flavors speak for themselves. After graduation, he stayed in Seattle, climbing from line cook to head chef. At 30, he opened Hayes Dining. What began as a modest space quickly became a destination for food lovers. A year later, he earned his first Michelin star, a milestone that sent his name echoing across the culinary world. The press called him Seattle's golden man of cuisine. Reservations filled months in advance. He stepped out in his white chef's coat to applause. To the world, Daniel was a symbol of success. But in his high-rise overlooking Elliott Bay, many nights he ate cold noodles alone. He had loved, or at least thought he had. A glamorous food critic, a successful entrepreneur, even a rising singer. Each story ended the same. They admired the glow around him, not the man behind the apron. Daniel grew used to loneliness. He smiled for guests, drafted new menus, signed contracts. But the emptiness remained. Until one day, he stepped into a small flower shop in Portland, seeking shelter from the rain, and met Clara Morgan, the woman who would teach him that some things no kitchen, no fame, no fortune could ever provide. The day Daniel met Clara Morgan, a light drizzle fell over Portland. He had just finished a business trip, his mind weighed down with schedules, proposals, and unanswered calls. All he wanted was 10 quiet minutes to breathe. As he walked down a cobblestone street, a flower shop appeared through the misted glass. Inside, warm light spilled over pots of daisies and roses. He pushed the door open, a small bell chiming like the beginning of a new chapter. Clara stood behind the counter, arranging white tulips. Her brown hair fell loosely around her shoulders. No makeup, no elaborate dress, just a worn beige sweater, neat and simple. When she looked up, her clear eyes met his. No surprise, no curiosity, only a calm recognition, as if she had known him for years. Looking for a particular flower? Her voice was gentle, each word precise, nothing extra. Daniel hesitated. He hadn't come to buy flowers, only to escape the rain. Maybe something simple, he replied, half honest, half uncertain. Clara nodded, walked over to a wooden shelf and picked out a small bunch of wildflowers. These are good for someone who needs a lighter day. She handed them to him with a faint, natural smile. Their fingers brushed just for a second. But Daniel felt more than skin. It was her presence, soft and steady. He held the bouquet a little tighter, afraid of losing something fleeting. The next day he returned. This time he claimed he needed flowers for a dining table. The day after, he came back again. "Which do you think suits a kitchen full of sunlight?" he asked. Clara tilted her head, then countered softly, "Do you prefer a subtle fragrance or something stronger?" The question made him laugh. It was the first time in a long while someone asked what he actually liked. And so Daniel became a regular. He bought flowers he never used. Bouquets sat on his desk, on chairs, in the kitchen. What he carried home wasn't petals, but moments. A few words exchanged, a glance, small stories about the shop's stubborn coffee machine, or Clara's habit of arranging flowers by color. Clara told him she often read books on the rooftop of her tiny apartment at night, where she could watch Portland's misty skies. Daniel listened, his heart softening. He wasn't the celebrated chef anymore, not Seattle's golden man of cuisine. With Clara, he was simply a man learning how to listen. One evening, they sat on a bench outside the shop after closing. Streetlights hummed in a low yellow glow, the air cool and quiet. Clara turned, her hair brushing across her face, and said softly, "You know, you're the first person who's ever made me want to say more than one sentence." Daniel froze, then smiled faintly. He reached out, gently touching her hand. And you," he whispered, "are the first person who's ever made me want to shut up and listen." In that moment, no crowd, no spotlight, just the hush of wind and the scent of flowers, Daniel realized some meetings don't need fireworks or grand design. Sometimes, all it takes is a door opening, a glance at the right time, and a life can change direction forever. Daniel and Clara's love didn't arrive like a storm. It crept in softly, like spring rain, slow, quiet, unnoticed by most. It began with moments so small that from the outside, they might seem trivial. But to them, each moment carried a weight words could never measure. One mild afternoon, they sat on the steps outside the flower shop, sharing a paper bag of roasted chestnuts. Clara peeled each shell carefully, handing them to Daniel, while he pretended to drop one just to make her laugh. As the sunset painted her hair gold, Daniel realized he needed no fine dinner. Her presence beside him was enough to fill his world. Another day, Daniel took Clara to the farmer's market. He never expected to enjoy listening to her explain the difference between dried lavender and fresh. Dried holds its scent longer, but fresh makes a space feel alive, she said, her eyes glimmering. Daniel chuckled. "You know, I'm like dried lavender, serious, worn out. But you're fresh lavender. The moment you appear, the room comes alive." Clara blushed, turning away, though her smile betrayed her. At night, by the Willamette River, they sat quietly on a stone bench, watching the water shimmer under city lights. Clara pulled her scarf tighter, and Daniel found himself sharing his childhood. He told her about his father, who believed cooking was a waste of time, and his mother, who kept his dream alive with every simple meal. Clara listened intently, sometimes nodding, sometimes asking small questions. "Is that why you keep your dishes simple?" she asked. Daniel blinked, surprised by her intuition. "Yes," he smiled. "I think pure flavors should speak for themselves, just like people. No need to disguise too much." Once, in a tiny tea shop scented with jasmine, Clara asked, "Do you ever feel lonely, even when the room is filled with applause?" Daniel paused, then nodded. "Yes, many times. I thought I had everything, but no one ever really saw the man behind the chef's coat." He stopped, then looked directly at her. "Until I met you." Clara said nothing. She only turned her teacup slowly, but her eyes spoke volumes. Daniel understood then. Sometimes what we need isn't an answer, but someone willing to sit and listen. Their rhythms began to intertwine naturally. Clara would visit Daniel's restaurant, not for grand meals, but to watch him stir the simplest soups. Daniel, in turn, visited the flower shop, pretending to pick blooms for events, but really just to watch Clara arrange stems with quiet focus. One evening, after cleaning the kitchen, Daniel held a bunch of daisies Clara had given him that morning. He texted, "These flowers make the apartment feel less cold." Clara replied minutes later, "And me? Do I make your heart less cold?" Daniel stared at the screen before smiling softly. "No, you don't just make it less cold. You make it want to live again." Their love grew in these fragments, reorganizing shelves together, cooking a dinner so salty they both laughed until tears came, sitting in silence without discomfort. Then one evening, under a sky scattered with stars outside Portland, Daniel stopped walking. He turned toward Clara, who wrapped a thin scarf around her shoulders, the breeze tossing her hair. He held her hand, his voice steady but trembling beneath the weight of it. "I once swore I'd never marry. I thought marriage was just a cage. But you make me want to break every rule I ever made." You make me want to stop, to finally call someone home." Clara's eyes widened, her heart tightening in her chest. She wasn't used to words that heavy with love. For a moment, she only bit her lip and looked up at the dark sky. Daniel didn't let go, his gaze unwavering. "I won't promise perfection, but if you'll let me, I'll do whatever it takes to marry you, no matter how long, no matter what it costs. I only want one thing, to call you my wife." In that moment, Clara gave the smallest nod. But small as it was enough to change everything. From then on, something between them shifted. No more hesitant glances, no more half-told stories. They began to live as though they had already found their belonging. Daniel felt he wasn't just falling in love. He was stepping into a journey unlike any before. A journey only Clara could lead him through. Daniel and Clara's wedding took place on a gentle Sunday afternoon at Cannon Beach, Oregon. There was no grand stage, no roaring orchestra, only the vast, quiet sea, strands of golden lights strung along wooden posts, and the faint scent of salt carried by the wind. Clara walked down a gravel path in a simple lace dress that hugged her slender frame. Her hair fell naturally, adorned with a wildflower she had picked that morning. No crown, no diamond necklace, only eyes shimmering with a brand new trust. Daniel stood beneath an arch of white blooms, dressed in a light gray suit without a tie. When he saw Clara, his breath caught. "This is the woman I will call home, from this day until the end," he thought. The ceremony had no officiant, no elaborate rituals. They read vows written by hand. Daniel held Clara's hand, his voice deep yet trembling. "You're not the first person I've ever met, but you're the only one I've ever wanted to keep. I promise you'll never wake up a single day wondering if you're loved." Clara smiled, her eyes glistening. She answered softly, her words as light as the breeze. "I don't bring much with me from the past, but I bring gratitude, because you saw me even when I thought I was invisible. If I may ask one thing, it's this. Let's choose each other every day." When the rings were exchanged, there were no fireworks, no blazing skies, only the tender glow of late afternoon settling over their hair, and an embrace long enough to become a vow without words. 2 days later, they flew to Maui for their honeymoon. Their villa sat tucked along a stretch of white sand, facing a sea as clear as glass. Each morning, Daniel slid open the balcony doors to let in the breeze and the whispers of the waves. Clara sat in a wicker chair, dressed in a simple maxi dress, a worn book in her hands. She said little, only smiled softly whenever she caught his gaze. At first, Daniel felt peace. They shared breakfasts of fresh fruit, drank coconut water under the palms, talked about trivial things. A cloud that looked like a dolphin, the balcony chair that always creaked when Clara sat down. No photos, no need to prove the moment. Just two people learning to belong to each other. But gradually, Daniel noticed a silence in Clara. Whenever he asked about her past, she smiled and steered the conversation elsewhere. Walking hand in hand along the beach, her eyes often drifted to the horizon, as if searching for something beyond his reach. One evening, rain fell softly across the villa's roof. Daniel was reading when he noticed Clara standing at the window, a cold cup of tea in her hand, her eyes following the raindrops down the glass. He called gently, "Clara." Daniel broke the silence gently. "Did I do something to make you uncomfortable?" She flinched slightly, then turned. A thin smile traced her lips, fragile as glass. "No, it's not you. It's me." Daniel set the book aside, leaned forward. He didn't press, only said softly, "Then tell me. Don't keep it all inside." Clara fell silent. Outside, the rain grew heavier. She drew in a deep breath, gathering what courage she had left. "Daniel," her voice quivered, "I've never loved anyone before you. Never held another man's hand. Never dated. Never been kissed. Every first I've ever had has been with you." Daniel froze. The words hung heavy yet delicate, like he could hear her heartbeat in them. Clara lowered her gaze, eyes shimmering. "It wasn't because I was cold, or because I chose to turn people away. I just never had the chance. I grew up in a tiny apartment with my sick grandmother. For most of my childhood, it was school, part-time jobs, and caring for her. No friends, no youth to waste on laughter. My world was books, flowers, and silence." She paused, tears slipping down. "Sometimes I feel like a blank page. I'm afraid that when you know this, you'll see me as empty, that you'll be disappointed I have no past to tell, no memories to share." Daniel rose and closed the distance, gently taking her trembling hand. It was thin, cold, but he held it firmly, as though pouring warmth straight from his heart. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "you're not empty. You've simply never been filled. And that's what I want to do. I want to write memories with you, to let our love fill every space you thought you lacked." Clara looked up. Her eyes, wet with tears, held both surprise and relief. "You're not disappointed?" she whispered. He shook his head with a faint smile. "No. I'm grateful you trusted me enough to tell me. I don't need a brilliant past. I only need you, here, now." Her tears fell again, but this time they cleansed instead of weighed her down. She pressed her face against his chest, her body trembling, then slowly easing. He wrapped his arms around her tightly, offering no more promises, only presence. That night, for the first time, they truly met, not through shy smiles or half-spoken stories, but in naked honesty. No more distance, no more invisible silence, only two souls touching, whole and unguarded. By morning, sunlight slipped through the curtains. Clara lay beside him, her small hand nestled in his, her face serene, her lips curved into a faint smile. Daniel looked at her and realized he hadn't just married a wife. He had found a beginning, a love that didn't need a past, only a present and a future they would write together. After their honeymoon, Daniel and Clara returned to Seattle. The high-rise apartment that once echoed with silence now carried the soft tread of Clara's steps and the gentle fragrance of flowers she brought along. She placed a small vase on the kitchen table, tucked daisies by the window, transforming the once cold space into something warm, alive. Daniel got used to rising early to brew coffee for the two of them, while Clara arranged flowers before starting the day. That quiet rhythm made Daniel, for the first time in years, feel that the apartment was no longer just a place to stay, but a home. One rainy afternoon, they wandered through the Capitol Hill. Amid the busy street stood an old, forgotten storefront. Its wooden sign was faded, glass panes clouded, the inside dark and dusty. Clara paused, pressing her hand against the glass. "I used to dream of a place like this," she whispered. "A little shop with flowers, the smell of coffee, and people who come not in a hurry." Daniel peered inside. Low ceilings, creaking floorboards, peeling corners. But instead of ruin, he pictured Clara behind a counter, her hands arranging fresh blooms, the air rich with coffee. The thought made him smile. "Do you think we could make it real?" he asked. Clara turned to him, her eyes alight. "With you, yes." The decision wasn't made in a single moment, but over many evenings spent talking. Daniel calculated costs, repairs, permits, Clara sketched shelves, wooden tables, a small reading corner. They wrote out details not just to open a shop, but to create a shared space, a shared dream. Weekends became workdays. Daniel built wooden shelves, painted walls, replaced the windows. Clara polished jars, hand-wrote labels, chose curtains. They worked side by side, laughing, collapsing on the floor with paint-stained hands, eyes still bright with hope. After 3 months, the shop was transformed. The floor gleamed, the walls glowed soft cream, the windows welcomed light. Shelves bloomed with flowers beside a small coffee counter. On the sign outside, they painted "Petal and Brew." On opening day, only a handful of neighbors came by. Clara stood behind the counter, her hands trembling but her smile radiant. Daniel poured coffee, the aroma blending with the scent of blossoms. They looked at each other, knowing this wasn't just a shop. It was the life they had chosen to build. That evening, with the lights turned off, Clara rested her head on Daniel's shoulder. "I never thought my dream could become real," she whispered. Daniel squeezed her hand, answering softly, "It's my dream too. Not the coffee, not the flowers, but making everything real with you." In that moment, they both understood. Happiness didn't need grandeur. It was in sweeping old dust together, repainting walls, and building a small place they could call ours. Life at Petal and Brew slowly settled into rhythm. Each morning, Clara unlocked the door, letting the scent of flowers drift onto the street. Daniel stood behind the counter, brewing coffee with a slower cadence than the high-pressure kitchens he once commanded. They didn't speak much of distant futures. They chose to live one day at a time, treasuring small joys. Then one spring morning, everything shifted. Clara stepped out of the bathroom, holding a test in her trembling hands, her eyes shimmering. Daniel was preparing coffee when he saw her face. He set the pot down quickly. "Clara?" She didn't answer, only handed him the stick. 2 pink lines stared back. For a moment, Daniel thought he had seen wrongly. Then he laughed, then choked on his own words. "Really?" Clara nodded, tears falling before her smile appeared. Daniel pulled her into his arms, his heartbeat racing. The world seemed to collapse into that single moment. Weeks later, their joy doubled when the doctor smiled and said, "I hear 2 heartbeats." Clara's lips parted in shock. Daniel gripped her hand tightly, his eyes welling. They looked at each other, unable to decide whether to laugh or cry, their love overflowing. From that day, Daniel transformed. He marked every appointment on his phone, learned to cook whatever Clara craved. At night, he stacked pillows around her to ease her sleep. Each morning, he bent to her belly, placed his hand gently, and whispered, "Good morning, little angels. Today your dad has a new story for you." The apartment and shop slowly changed. The spare room was painted a calming blue, with stickers of clouds and stars. Daniel built 2 identical wooden cribs, stacked diapers neatly, folded tiny towels into drawers. Clara, though often tired, glowed softly each time she saw him crouched on the floor, fumbling with toys or smoothing wallpaper. One afternoon, as Daniel hung curtains, Clara leaned against the doorway, her hand resting on her round belly. "Are you scared?" she asked softly. Daniel turned, smiling. "Yes, but if I get to do this with you, I feel brave enough." They stood in silence for a long moment, then laughed together. They knew no one could ever be fully prepared for parenthood, but they had love, enough to welcome whatever came next. When Clara went into labor, Daniel gripped her hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. In the hospital room, every sound faded, leaving only his pounding heart and Clara's heavy breaths. Then came two sharp cries, one after another. A boy. A girl. Clara sobbed as the nurse placed the tiny girl into her arms. "Lila," she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel cradled his son, Ethan's tiny fingers curling around his own, gripping so firmly it felt like his whole heart was caught. Daniel bent down, murmuring, "I'm here, son. Dad's here." The first days were far from easy. Night after sleepless night, cries pierced the quiet. Clara paced the room with Lila, humming softly. Daniel fumbled with bottles, sometimes spilling in his nervous haste. They exchanged weary glances, then laughed through exhaustion. "I thought I knew pressure," Daniel muttered while changing Ethan's diaper. "But a crying baby makes a kitchen rush look like nothing." Clara chuckled, her voice thin but full of love. "You're doing better than you think." Petal and brew changed too. Bottles sat beside vases of tulips, baby babble blended with the hiss of the coffee machine. Regulars often lingered to pinch Lila's chubby cheeks or smile at Ethan's wide grin in his father's arms. The shop, once their dream, was now part of their children's childhood. Some mornings, the kitchen was chaos. Unwashed bottles, diapers tossed aside. The smell of coffee mingling with warm milk. Daniel held Ethan, Clara cradled Lila, and they sat across from each other in silence. No words were needed. Their silence wasn't distance anymore. It was a new language, the language of family. One autumn afternoon, golden light streamed through the shop windows. Ethan sprawled on the rug, smacking at an open book. Lila giggled as Clara handed her a small daisy. Daniel read aloud, his steady voice calming both children. Clara sat quietly, her chest tightening with emotion. For years she had believed she had nothing worth keeping, no past to offer. But here, in a room filled with children's laughter, she finally understood. Happiness doesn't need a perfect past. It is built in the simplest moments. An exchanged glance during sleepless nights. A hand held in a messy kitchen. Time passed, and Ethan and Lila grew day by day. From their first wobbly steps to the sweet babble of Mama and Dada, their little home and Petal and Brew became more than a shop of flowers and coffee. It became a treasury of family memories. Each morning, familiar customers entered, smiling at the sight of the twins toddling between flower stands and wooden tables. Daniel often pretended to scold, "Ethan, no playing with the water in the vases," but couldn't help laughing when his son handed the flowers to his mother. Clara cradled Lila, gently soothing, "Slow down, sweetheart." These sounds blended with coffee and blossoms, composing a melody of everyday life. Daniel once thought he'd never hear. One winter evening, after closing the shop, the family gathered around the dinner table. Clara sliced bread, Daniel poured tea, and the twins competed to tell stories only children could invent. Ethan proudly showed a drawing of their family beneath a sky full of stars, while Lila declared it was the happiest house in the world. Daniel sat quietly, his chest swelling with gratitude. He remembered the lonely nights he once spent, eating alone in a silent apartment. And now, he was living in a dream he never dared to dream. That night, with both children asleep, Clara leaned on her husband's shoulder. She whispered, "Daniel, I used to think I was empty, but I was only waiting for you and the children to fill me." Daniel clasped her hand, his eyes glistening. "I once thought happiness was fame, Michelin stars, success, but none of it compares to this moment, when you lean on me and our children sleep inside. I already have everything I need." Clara smiled, tears slipping free. She thought, if anyone ever asked her what happiness was, she wouldn't speak of rose-strewn paths or distant dreams. She would tell them of mornings scented with coffee and flowers, of tiny hands clutching their parents, of the way Daniel looked at her as if she were the only one. That night, as the streetlights glowed against the window, Daniel whispered, "Happiness isn't something we find out there. It's here, in the simplest things. And as long as we keep choosing each other every day, happiness will stay." Clara nodded, resting her head against his chest. Inside, Ethan and Lila breathed softly. Outside, a light rain fell over the quiet street. In that peace, they knew their story didn't end here. It was only beginning, a story that didn't need perfection, only truth, fullness, and forever.